Cowboy sat on the weathered porch of his modest cabin, watching the sun bleed orange across the endless Arizona desert. At 43, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. The wind carried dust and memories across the barren landscape, but today it brought something else, a letter that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude. The envelope was yellowed with age, delivered by a nervous postal clerk who'd ridden hard from Tucson. Cowboy's weathered hands trembled slightly as he recognized the handwriting. Marcus Thompson, his oldest friend, his former partner in the cattle business, the only man who'd ever truly understood him. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone," the letter began. "The consumption finally got me, just like it got Sarah. But before I go, I need you to do something for me, something I should have asked years ago. There's a boy, Sammy. He's 8 years old, and he's been living at the orphanage in Deadwood since his mother died last winter. His father, well, that's complicated. I've been sending money for his care, but now that I'm gone, he has nowhere to go." Cowboy's jaw tightened. Marcus had never mentioned a child, never spoken of any obligations beyond their shared business ventures. The letter continued with details that made his blood run cold. "The boy doesn't speak, hasn't said a word since his mother's death. The folks at the orphanage think he's simple, but I know better. He's smart as a whip, just carrying a burden too heavy for such small shoulders. I'm asking you to take him in, not out of charity, but because he's family in ways you don't yet understand. There's something else you need to know about Sammy, something I should have told you years ago, but I was too much of a coward. When you see him, you'll understand why I kept this secret. Please don't let my failures destroy an innocent child's future." The letter ended with coordinates to the Deadwood orphanage and a cryptic warning. "Trust no one in Millbrook with this information. The boy's safety depends on your discretion." 3 days later, Cowboy found himself standing outside the Deadwood orphanage, a grim building that looked more like a prison than a home for children. The matron, Mrs. Hartwell, was a stern woman with suspicious eyes who clearly disapproved of his rough appearance. "You're here for the Thompson boy?" she asked, looking him up and down. "I must say, Mr. Marcus was very specific about who could take custody. You have the papers?" Cowboy handed over the legal documents Marcus had prepared. As Mrs. Hartwell reviewed them, he heard the sound of children playing in the courtyard. Among the voices, one was notably absent. "He's a strange one, that Sammy," Mrs. Hartwell said, shaking her head. "Hasn't spoken a word since he arrived. Some of the other children are frightened of him. He has these intense eyes, like he's seeing things the rest of us can't." She led Cowboy through a maze of corridors to a small room where a boy sat alone by the window, staring out at the desert. When Sammy turned around, Cowboy's breath caught in his throat. The child had the same piercing blue eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same dark hair that Cowboy remembered from his own reflection 20 years ago. But it was more than physical resemblance that stopped Cowboy cold. There was something in the boy's gaze, a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. Sammy looked at him not with the curiosity of a child meeting a stranger, but with the recognition of someone who'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Hello, Sammy," Cowboy said softly, kneeling to the boy's level. "I'm here to take you home." The boy nodded once, as if he'd expected this all along, and began gathering his few possessions: a worn Bible, a small wooden horse, and a locket that he clutched protectively to his chest. The journey back to Millbrook took 2 days on horseback, with Sammy riding behind Cowboy in complete silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. The boy seemed to communicate through glances and gestures, and Cowboy found himself understanding the child's needs without words being spoken. As they approached Millbrook, Cowboy felt a growing sense of unease. The town had always been suspicious of outsiders, and bringing home a mysterious orphan would certainly raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The resemblance between him and Sammy was too strong to ignore, and people would draw their own conclusions. The first person they encountered was Sheriff Morrison, a fair but rigid man who'd known Cowboy for over a decade. His eyes immediately fixed on Sammy, and Cowboy saw the wheels turning in the lawman's mind. "Well, well," Morrison said slowly, "and who might this young man be?" "This is Sammy," Cowboy replied carefully. "I'm taking care of him for a while." Morrison's gaze shifted between the man and boy, noting the obvious similarities. "Taking care of him? That's mighty generous of you, Cowboy. Where'd he come from?" "Deadwood Orphanage. His guardian died and I promised to help out." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Morrison seemed to sense there was more to the story, but before he could press further, Sammy stepped forward and extended his hand to the sheriff in a gesture so adult and dignified that it caught everyone off guard. Morrison shook the boy's hand, his expression softening slightly. "Well, any friend of Cowboy's is welcome in Millbrook. You staying at his place?" Cowboy nodded, eager to end the conversation. As they walked toward his cabin, he could feel the eyes of the townspeople following them. By evening, he knew, the entire town would be buzzing with speculation about the mysterious boy who looked so much like their reclusive neighbor. That night, as Sammy slept in the small bed Cowboy had hastily prepared, the older man sat by the fire, reading Marcus's letter again. There were still so many unanswered questions. Who was Sammy's father? Why had Marcus kept the boy's existence a secret? And what was the danger that required such discretion? As if sensing his thoughts, Sammy appeared in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted against the darkness. He walked to Cowboy and placed a small, worn photograph on the table. In the flickering firelight, Cowboy could make out 3 figures: Marcus, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, and a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out. Sammy pointed to the defaced figure, then to himself, then to Cowboy. The message was clear. This man was connected to both of them in ways that someone had wanted to hide. Cowboy looked into the boy's intelligent eyes and realized that Sammy knew far more about his own story than anyone suspected. The child wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was carrying secrets that could change everything. "Tomorrow, we'll start figuring this out together," Cowboy promised quietly. Sammy nodded and returned to bed, leaving Cowboy alone with the photograph and a growing certainty that their arrival in Millbrook had set something dangerous in motion. Outside, the desert wind howled like a warning, and in the distance, the sound of approaching hoofbeats suggested that their past was already catching up with them. When secrets surface, trust becomes a luxury. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Cowboy was awakened by urgent knocking at his door. Sheriff Morrison stood on the porch, his face grim and his hand resting on his gun. "We need to talk," Morrison said, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin. "Mind if I come in?" Cowboy stepped aside, noting how the sheriff's gaze immediately sought out Sammy, who was quietly eating breakfast at the small wooden table. The boy looked up with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, but continued eating without acknowledging the visitor. "Got some interesting news from Tucson yesterday," Morrison began, settling into a chair across from Cowboy. "Seems there's been some inquiries about a missing boy. Description matches your young friend here pretty closely." Cowboy's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that come with a substantial reward attached," Morrison replied, watching Cowboy's reaction carefully. "Man named Vincent Blackwood has been asking questions. Claims the boy is... His nephew says he's been searching for months." At the mention of the name Blackwood, Sammy's fork clattered to his plate. The boy's face went pale, and his hands began to tremble. He looked at Cowboy with an expression of pure terror, then bolted from the table and ran to the back room. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Interesting reaction for a boy who supposedly doesn't understand what's being said. Cowboy followed Sammy to the back room, where he found the child huddled in the corner, clutching the locket he always carried. When Cowboy knelt beside him, Sammy opened the locket to reveal a small photograph of a woman and a folded piece of paper with a single word written in a child's handwriting: "Danger." "Sheriff," Cowboy called, returning to the main room with new resolve, "I think you need to hear the whole story." For the next hour, Cowboy shared everything he knew: Marcus's letter, the boy's mysterious past, and the warning about trusting no one in Millbrook. Morrison listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "So you're telling me this Blackwood character might not be who he claims to be?" Morrison asked. "I'm telling you that boy is terrified of that name, and Marcus warned me specifically about keeping Sammy's presence here quiet. That's good enough for me." Morrison nodded slowly. "Well, it's good enough for me, too. But we've got a problem. Word's already spreading through town about the boy. Mrs. Henderson saw you two yesterday and has been telling everyone who'll listen about the mysterious child who looks just like you. By now, half the territory probably knows there's a boy in Millbrook." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses approaching filled the air. Through the window, Cowboy could see a group of well-dressed men dismounting in front of the general store. Even from a distance, there was something menacing about their purposeful movements. "That'll be them," Morrison said grimly. "Blackwood and his associates. They rode in about an hour ago, asking questions." Cowboy's mind raced. If these men were truly looking for Sammy, and if the boy's reaction was any indication, they weren't here with good intentions. But why would Marcus have hidden the boy from his own family? Unless... "Sheriff, I need you to do something for me," Cowboy said urgently. "Send a telegram to the territorial marshal in Phoenix. Ask him to check on Vincent Blackwood. Find out who he really is and what his connection to the boy might be." Morrison nodded. "Already thought of that. Sent the wire this morning. Should have an answer by evening." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Cowboy could see a tall, impeccably dressed man with cold eyes and a practiced smile. Two other men flanked him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Mr. Cowboy," the man called through the door, "my name is Vincent Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Morrison positioned himself by the window, while Cowboy approached the door. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm looking for my nephew, Samuel. I have reason to believe he's in your care. The boy has been missing for months, and his family is quite worried about him." Cowboy opened the door, but didn't invite the men inside. Up close, Blackwood was even more intimidating, well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of cold confidence that came from a lifetime of getting what he wanted through intimidation. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Cowboy said calmly. "I don't have anyone's nephew." Blackwood's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Perhaps I wasn't clear. The boy is about 8 years old, dark hair, blue eyes, very distinctive features. I'm told he bears a striking resemblance to you, actually." "Lots of children have dark hair and blue eyes," Cowboy replied. "Doesn't make them related to me?" "Of course not," Blackwood agreed smoothly. "But this particular boy has some very unique characteristics. He doesn't speak, for instance. Traumatized by witnessing his mother's death, poor child. And he carries a distinctive locket that belonged to his grandmother." Cowboy felt his heart sink. Blackwood knew too many specific details about Sammy to be bluffing, but the man's demeanor and the obvious threat posed by his companions suggested that family reunion wasn't his true motivation. "Even if such a boy existed," Cowboy said carefully, "what proof do you have that you're his uncle?" Blackwood reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document. "Legal guardianship papers signed by the territorial court. The boy's mother named me as his guardian before her death." Morrison stepped forward to examine the papers. After a long moment, he looked up with a troubled expression. "These looked legitimate, Cowboy." But Sammy had appeared in the doorway behind them, and when he saw Blackwood, the boy's reaction was immediate and visceral. He let out a sound, not quite a scream, but a wordless cry of pure terror that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Then he turned and ran. Blackwood's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory beneath the polished exterior. "As you can see, the boy is quite disturbed. He needs proper medical care, which I'm prepared to provide." "The boy seems pretty clear about not wanting to go with you," Morrison observed. "Children often fear what's best for them," Blackwood replied smoothly. "I'm sure once he's had time to adjust, he'll remember how much his family loves him." Cowboy made a decision that would change everything. "Sheriff, I'd like to formally request that you hold those guardianship papers for verification. Something about this doesn't feel right." Morrison nodded. "I think that's reasonable. Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to need to verify these documents with the territorial court before I can allow you to take custody of any child." Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Sheriff, I assure you these papers are completely legitimate. Every day that boy remains in unsuitable care puts him at greater risk." "Risk from what?" Cowboy asked pointedly. "The boy has enemies," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "His father made some very poor choices before his death. There are people who would use the child to settle old scores. And you're here to protect him from these people?" "I'm here to take him somewhere safe, yes." Morrison stepped between them. "Well, until I can verify your identity and these papers, the boy stays where he is. That's final." Blackwood's facade finally dropped completely. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. That boy is in possession of information that could be very dangerous in the wrong hands. For everyone's safety, he needs to come with me now." "What kind of information?" Cowboy demanded. "The kind that gets people killed," Blackwood replied coldly. "The kind that his father died trying to protect." The admission hung in the air like a threat. Blackwood had just revealed that Sammy's father was dead, and that his death was connected to some kind of dangerous secret. But instead of making Cowboy more willing to hand over the boy, it only strengthened his resolve to protect him. "Then it sounds like the safest place for him is right here, under the protection of the law," Morrison said firmly. Blackwood's eyes flicked between the sheriff and Cowboy, calculating his options. Finally, he smiled that cold smile again. "Very well, Sheriff. I'll wait for your verification, but I hope you understand that every hour of delay puts that boy, and everyone around him, in greater danger." As Blackwood and his men mounted their horses and rode toward the hotel, Morrison turned to Cowboy with a grim expression. "I don't like this one bit. That man's hiding something, and whatever it is, it's big enough to kill for." Cowboy nodded, his mind already working on their next move. "We need to find out who Sammy's father really was, and what he was involved in. And we need to do it before Blackwood decides to stop playing by the rules." As evening approached, the telegram from Phoenix arrived with information that changed everything they thought they knew about Vincent Blackwood, and revealed a connection to Cowboy's own past that would shake the very foundations of his world. When the past refuses to stay buried. The telegram from Phoenix arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Millbrook's dusty main street. Sheriff Morrison's face grew increasingly grim as he read the message, and when he looked up at Cowboy, his expression was grave. "Vincent Blackwood is real," Morrison said slowly, "but he's not the boy's uncle. He's a bounty hunter with a reputation for taking jobs that other men won't touch. The territorial marshal says he's suspected of several murders, but nothing's ever been proven." Cowboy felt his blood turn to ice. "What else?" "There's more. The marshal did some digging into the boy's background. Sammy's real name is Samuel Marcus Thompson, named after your friend Marcus, apparently. But here's the part that's going to shock you. His father was James Diamond Jim Garrett." The name hit Cowboy like a physical blow. Diamond Jim Garrett, the most notorious outlaw in the territory, leader of the Garrett gang that had terrorized the Southwest for over a decade. But more than that, Diamond Jim had been Cowboy's partner in their early days, before everything went wrong. "That's impossible," Cowboy whispered. "Jim died 5 years ago in a shootout with federal marshals." "That's what everyone thought," Morrison continued, "but according to this, he survived and went into hiding. Been living under an assumed name with a woman named Sarah Thompson, Marcus's sister. They had the boy, and when Sarah died last winter, Jim brought Sammy to Marcus for safekeeping. 3 weeks later, Jim was found dead in an alley in Tucson with a bullet in his back." The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. But the picture they formed was more terrifying than Cowboy had imagined. Sammy wasn't just any orphan. He was the son of the most wanted man in the territory, and apparently he knew something that made him valuable enough to kill for. "There's something else," Morrison said quietly. "The marshal mentioned that before Diamond Jim went into hiding, he was rumored to have hidden a fortune in stolen gold somewhere in the territory. The location was never found." Cowboy's mind raced back to the photograph Sammy had shown him, the one with the scratched-out face. That had been Jim, he realized now. But why had someone tried to hide his identity? And what did Sammy know about his father's hidden treasure? A commotion outside interrupted his thoughts. Through the window they could see Blackwood and his men surrounding the cabin, no longer making any pretense of civility. The bounty hunter's voice carried clearly through the evening air. "I know you're in there, boy. Your father's dead, and his secrets died with him. But you're going to tell me where he hid that gold, or things are going to get very unpleasant for everyone in this town." Morrison checked his rifle and moved to the window. "Looks like our friend has decided to stop playing games." Cowboy made his way to the back room where Sammy was hiding. The boy was sitting on the bed, holding his locket and staring at the wall with those unnaturally mature eyes. When Cowboy entered, Sammy looked up and spoke for the first time since his arrival. "He killed my papa," the boy said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him do it." The words hit Cowboy like a thunderbolt. Not only could Sammy speak, but he was a witness to his father's murder. No wonder Blackwood was so desperate to get his hands on the boy. "Can you tell me what happened?" Cowboy asked gently, sitting beside the child. Sammy's small hands trembled as he opened the locket. Inside, along with his mother's picture, was a tiny piece of paper with numbers written on it. "Papa said these numbers were important. He said if anything happened to him, I should give them to Uncle Marcus or to the man with the same eyes as me." Cowboy studied the numbers. 32, 45, 17, 89. They could be coordinates, or a combination, or any number of things. But whatever they represented, they were important enough that Jim Garrett had entrusted them to his 8-year-old son. "Sammy, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw the night your father died." The boy's voice was steady despite his obvious fear. "Papa and I were staying in a hotel in Tucson. He said we were going to meet Uncle Marcus in the morning and that everything would be safe after that. But that man came to our room. He said Papa owed him something, and Papa said he didn't have it anymore. Then they fought, and Papa told me to hide under the bed." Sammy paused, his young face showing the strain of reliving the traumatic memory. "The man shot Papa and then started looking through everything. He found Papa's bag and got really angry when it was empty. He kept asking where it was, but Papa was already gone. How did you get away? Papa always taught me to be quiet and quick. When the man left to get help moving Papa's body, I climbed out the window and ran. I hid in the church until morning, then went to the orphanage like Papa always said to do if something bad happened." Outside, Blackwood's voice grew more threatening. "I'm losing patience. Send the boy out now, or I'll come in and take him." Morrison called back. "You're surrounded by the law, Blackwood. Stand down or face the consequences." But Cowboy could see through the window that Morrison was outgunned. Blackwood had at least 6 men with him, all armed and positioned strategically around the cabin. The sheriff was brave, but he was only one man. "Sammy," Cowboy said urgently, "I need you to listen carefully. Do you remember anything else your father told you about those numbers?" The boy nodded. "He said they were the key to making sure I'd never have to worry about money. He said the treasure was hidden where the eagle watches over the valley, and these numbers would show the way." Eagle Valley. Cowboy knew it well. It was a remote canyon about 20 miles north of town, dominated by a massive rock formation that looked like a giant eagle with outstretched wings. If Jim had hidden his stolen gold there, it would explain why Blackwood was so desperate to get his hands on Sammy. A gunshot rang out, followed by Morrison's voice. "That was a warning shot." The next one won't be. Cowboy made a decision that would either save them all or get them killed. Sammy, we're going to have to make a run for it. There's a back way out of here that leads to the stable. Can you ride? The boy nodded. Papa taught me. Good. We're going to Eagle Valley. If your father hid something there, we need to find it before Blackwood does. It might be the only way to end this. They slipped out the back window as Morrison continued his standoff with Blackwood's men. The stable was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles as they crept through the shadows. Cowboy's horse, Thunder, was already saddled, a habit from his outlaw days that had served him well. As they mounted the horse, Sammy whispered, "Mr. Cowboy, are you really my papa's friend?" "I was, a long time ago. Before he became Diamond Jim, he was just Jim Garrett, and we rode together. We weren't outlaws then. We were just young men trying to make our way in the world." "What happened?" Cowboy urged Thunder into a quiet walk toward the canyon trail. "Your father made some bad choices, and I made the choice not to follow him down that path. I've regretted it ever since, because maybe if I'd stayed, I could have helped him find a better way." "Is that why you're helping me now?" The question was so mature, so perceptive, that it took Cowboy's breath away. This child had inherited more than just his father's looks. He had Jim's intelligence and his mother's wisdom. "Partly," Cowboy admitted, "but mostly because you're a good boy who deserves a chance at a better life than the one your father had." Behind them, the sound of gunfire erupted as Blackwood's patience finally ran out. Morrison was holding his own, but Cowboy knew the sheriff couldn't hold them off forever. They had maybe an hour's head start before Blackwood realized his quarry had escaped. As they rode through the moonlit desert toward Eagle Valley, Sammy asked one more question that would haunt Cowboy for the rest of his life. "If we find Papa's treasure, will that make the bad man go away?" "I hope so, son," Cowboy replied, though he suspected that finding the gold would only be the beginning of their troubles. "I really hope so." The moon was high overhead when they reached the entrance to Eagle Valley, and somewhere in the darkness behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew steadily closer. Where truth and redemption converge under desert stars. Eagle Valley stretched before them like a moonlit cathedral, its towering walls casting deep shadows across the canyon floor. The massive rock formation that gave the valley its name loomed overhead, its eagle-like silhouette seeming to watch their every move. Cowboy and Sammy had perhaps 30 minutes before Blackwood and his men caught up to them. "The numbers, Sammy," Cowboy said urgently as they dismounted near the base of the Eagle Rock. "Your father said they were the key. Let me see them again." Sammy opened his locket with trembling fingers, 32, 45, 17, 89. In the moonlight, Cowboy studied the formation around them, looking for any clue that might connect to the numbers. Then he noticed something. Carved into the rock at eye level were faint markings that looked like they'd been made with a knife. "Look at this," he said, running his fingers over the carved symbols. They were coordinates, but not the kind used for maps. They were measurements, paces and directions that would lead from this exact spot. 32 paces north," Cowboy muttered, counting out the steps. Then 45 paces east. Each step took them deeper into the canyon, following a path that Jim Garrett had carefully planned years ago. At the final position, they found themselves standing before a seemingly solid rock wall, but when Cowboy examined it closely, He could see that some of the rocks had been carefully arranged to hide a narrow opening. 17 rocks from the left, 89 inches up, Sammy said, understanding the pattern. Together, they found the specific rock and pushed. It moved easily, revealing a hidden lever that opened a section of the wall like a door. Inside the hidden chamber, their eyes widened in amazement. Gold bars, jewelry, and bags of coins were stacked neatly along the walls, the accumulated wealth from years of Diamond Jim's criminal activities. But there was something else that made Cowboy's heart stop. A leather journal with his own name written on the cover. With shaking hands, he opened the journal and began to read Jim's final words. "If you're reading this, old friend, then I'm dead, and my boy needs your help. I know I made mistakes, more than any man has a right to make, but Sammy is innocent of all of it. The gold in this cave represents every crime I ever committed, every life I ruined, every family I destroyed. I can't undo the past, but maybe this treasure can be used to make things right. I've kept records of everyone we robbed, every bank we hit, every family we hurt. The money should go back to them or to their descendants. All except for enough to give Sammy a good life, a clean life, far away from the shadows of his father's sins. There's something else you need to know, something I should have told you years ago. The reason I turned to crime wasn't just greed or excitement. I was being blackmailed by Vincent Blackwood. He knew about a mistake I made when I was young. A man died because of my carelessness, and Blackwood had proof. He forced me to work for him, taking a cut of everything I stole. When I tried to go straight after meeting Sarah, Blackwood threatened to expose everything and have me hanged, so I faked my death and tried to disappear. But he found me anyway. He killed Sarah to send me a message, and when I still refused to tell him where the gold was hidden, he killed me too. Sammy saw it all. That boy has been carrying the weight of my sins and the trauma of watching his parents die. He deserves better than the legacy I've left him. Please, old friend, help him find a way to live with honor, something I never managed to do." The sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon, snapping Cowboy back to the present. Blackwood had found them. "Sammy," Cowboy said urgently, "I need you to stay hidden in here no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, but his eyes were filled with fear. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to end this once and for all." Cowboy stepped out of the hidden chamber just as Blackwood and his men rode into the clearing. The bounty hunter's face was twisted with rage and desperation. "Where is he?" Blackwood snarled, dismounting with his gun drawn. "Where's the boy?" "He's safe," Cowboy replied calmly. "But you and I need to settle this between us, Vincent. Just like we should have done 20 years ago." Blackwood's eyes widened in recognition. "Well, I'll be damned. If it isn't Jim Garrett's old partner. I wondered when you'd show up. You killed Jim and his wife. You terrorized an innocent child. And for what? Money that was never really yours to begin with? That gold represents years of work," Blackwood spat. "Jim owed me, and now the boy owes me. It's simple business." "No," Cowboy said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally found his purpose. "It's over." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Blackwood, confident in his superior numbers, made the mistake of underestimating a man who'd spent 20 years preparing for this moment. When the gun smoke cleared, Blackwood lay dead, and his surviving men had fled into the desert. Sheriff Morrison arrived with a posse just as the sun was rising, having followed their trail through the night. When Cowboy explained everything, Jim's journal, the hidden treasure, Blackwood's crimes, the sheriff listened with growing amazement. "So what happens now?" Morrison asked. Cowboy looked at Sammy, who had emerged from the cave and was standing quietly beside him. "Now we do what Jim wanted. We return the stolen money to the families who were robbed. We make sure Sammy has enough for a good education and a fresh start, and we give him the chance to choose his own path." Over the following weeks, the story of the treasure in Eagle Valley spread throughout the territory. Families who had lost everything to the Garrett gang were contacted and compensated. The territorial government used a portion of the recovered funds to establish schools and hospitals in remote communities. Sammy, meanwhile, began to heal. With Blackwood dead and his father's secrets finally revealed, the boy started speaking more freely. He was indeed as intelligent as Marcus had claimed, with a natural aptitude for learning that amazed his new teacher. Cowboy legally adopted Sammy, giving the boy his name and his protection. They built a new life together on a small ranch outside Millbrook, where Sammy could grow up surrounded by honest work and good people. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Sammy asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Do you think Papa would be proud of what we did with his treasure?" Cowboy considered the question carefully. "I think your father spent his whole life trying to find a way to make up for his mistakes. In the end, he found it through you. By trusting you with those numbers, by writing that journal, by making sure the money went to the right people, he finally did something truly good." And Uncle Marcus, do you think he knew this would happen? "I think Marcus knew exactly what he was doing when he brought us together," Cowboy replied. "He saw something in both of us that we couldn't see in ourselves, the possibility of redemption." Years later, when Sammy had grown into a fine young man and become a respected lawyer dedicated to helping the disadvantaged, people would still talk about the mysterious boy who came to Millbrook and the treasure that changed so many lives. But for Cowboy, the real treasure had never been the gold hidden in Eagle Valley. It had been the chance to raise a good son, to honor an old friend's final wish, and to prove that even the darkest past could be redeemed through love, courage, and the willingness to do what's right. As the stars came out over the desert, father and son sat in comfortable silence, both knowing that they had found something more valuable than any treasure. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found their way home. The legend of the Silent Promise lived on, not as a story of hidden gold or dangerous outlaws, but as a testament to the power of second chances and the unbreakable bonds that form when two lost souls find their way to each other across the vast expanse of the American frontier. In the end, the boy who had arrived in silence had given voice to the greatest truth of all. That family isn't always about blood, but about the promises we make and keep, the love we choose to give, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be watching. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.